Check 1, 2. Check.
Going to be the British tick, 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 tick mark.
Is that what they say? And in Spanish, it's probando.
Oh.
Uno, dos, tres. Are we recording? Are you going to include this in the...
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Unfolding Revelation podcast series produced in partnership with Wayfarers Christian Church. My name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor at Wayfarers Christian Church, and I am joined once again by professor at Mid-South Christian College and Revelation superfan, Greg Waddell.
Hey, everybody.
Super fan.
Revelation superfan. That's what I'm going to start going with. You've been a fan since the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Since the beginning. Since you've been a believer, right?
There may be somebody out there that remembers Dr. Friskney, Tom Friskney, back in Cincinnati Bible College. And he's the one that really turned me on to eschatology as a whole, the study of end things, and particularly the book of Revelation. So, yeah.
So from like beginning of Bible college there.
Well, to give you an idea, I was, 22 years old?
Right.
At the time?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much the beginning.
And, about 10 years ago or so.
Right. And I'm also joined by, what did we decide on? Indiana Jones Adventurer.
There you go.
Not for the past week or the next.
Also a fan of Revelation, fan of the Old Testament. If you're watching the video feed of this, you may see the boot on his leg. He got a little too much into the adventuring here recently, and
Got too much accomplishment this past week.
a little bit of an injury. So we're hoping Zach's going to be good. But Zach House.
Bye.
So it's our last intro series before we're going to jump right into the text itself. I know some of you are itching to get into the text, as I know we are as well. But we think these intro series have been important to cover because we're trying to avoid the pitfalls that so many people have when looking at the book. And we're just trying to develop good best practices so that we can do it in a way that helps us really get to the meaning of what the author intended. So we've done 3 intros so far. This is our 4th one. And this one is a fun one on figurative language.
As opposed to all the other ones we've done, have not been fun.
Not as fun as fantastic images that you may find when using figurative language.
True.
Greg, you were explaining to us a little bit beforehand that you had a conversation once with somebody that was upset with you because they were saying,
Yeah.
you don't take the book of Revelation literally?
Right. Like this accusation, I don't take the book of Revelation. And I said to them, you don't either. And they said, yes, I do. And I said, so you believe that a literal dragon came down to eat Jesus? Revelation chapter 12.
Right after he was born.
Right after he was born. Well, no, he said. And I pointed out that it's impossible to take the book of Revelation literally. So basically what people mean usually when they say that is, you're not looking for some political figures today that are represented in the book of Revelation. That's a particular, but everybody has to recognize that the book is full of metaphors, metaphorical language, and symbols.
So, the point is we're all looking at it figuratively in some form or another.
Yeah.
So rather than just take our biases and assumptions as a given, let's understand exactly what it is that we're doing. And like I said at the beginning, let's figure out some best practices for it. So best place to start is probably figuring out a definition. What do we mean when we say figurative language? Where would you start for us, Greg, on defining that?
First of all, understanding that this is an apocalyptic literature, and that's so the use of figurative language is very strong in this type. In fact, some call it a hyper version of figurative language, a hyper version of prophecy, as a matter of fact. But the reason it's necessary because the book of Revelation is talking about things that we have not experienced or things we have never seen. before. If you're talking about the spiritual realm, you can't see the spiritual realm with your eyes. And so the only alternative that we have is to use figurative language. And understanding this is really important because, believe it or not, many cults have been started from a literal interpretation of the book of Revelation. Well, one of them is the mass suicides in Guyana with the, what was his name?
The drink the Kool-Aid guy?
Yeah, the drink the Kool-Aid guy.
I don't remember his name either.
Jim Jones. Jim Jones. I was going to say Bob Jones. Jim Jones. But it's interesting that a lot of these got started with some verse in the book of Revelation or some interpretation. So we don't want to do that.
Right.
We want to avoid that.
We don't have Kool-Aid here at Wayfarers. We have wine.
Greg may have told us a story at the beginning of this podcast where he started a cult in South America,
I said
possibly.
I may have. Because I didn't speak Spanish, and yet they asked me to teach the book of Revelation. I was like, okay, I have no idea what I did.
You have no idea. You may have started a cult. So we're trying to avoid that here. We're trying to make sure that we understand the type of language that's being used, and we're trying not to make the mistakes that other people may have made in the past when it comes to the book. So, where do we start on trying to understand how figurative language works?
So,
and what's the best way to go about
We need to understand the nature of figurative language. Its intended meaning of the language is not the way you would take that language in a normal situation. They're using the language to point at something else. So, the example of a shadow, for example, it's kind of like a shadow. The shadow is the language that they're using. The actual tree is the thing that they're pointing at. Or we might use some of the examples in the scriptures of Jesus being called a lamb, the Lamb of God. He's not literally a lamb. The figure of a lamb is pointing at Jesus. Now, the important thing is that between these two things, between the lamb and Jesus, there has to be a similarity. Because without the similarity, the figure doesn't work. The figure is based on that similarity. And so in this case, the lamb, we know, was used in the sacrifices of the Old Testament. And so that's where the similarity comes in. So there's always a similarity.
You can't just pick a random word and be like, I'm going to say bouncy ball, and anytime I say that, it means Greg.
There are situations where that happens, but that's called a symbol.
A symbol.
When a thing with no connection with the meaning comes to have that meaning simply because the society has given it that meaning. The coffee people that have the little angel type symbol.
Oh, yeah.
Starbucks. Why can't I say that? Duh.
Yeah, they have the mermaid.
What's that got to do with... Or maybe it does. Maybe at one time it does, but over time it loses that connection and it just becomes a symbol.
I'm just kind of asking these because I think it's important to really define exactly what it is that we're talking about here. I don't think I've ever used the term figurative language before this podcast, so I want to make sure I understand exactly what is meant by that word. So the first point you brought up for us there, the important one, it's kind of like a shadow, something that has a connection to the thing that it's representing, but it's not necessarily the exact thing.
Right, and one of the mistakes of interpretation sometimes is when we push that comparison too far. So you have to look for the main similarity between the two. But if you push it too far, you start saying, well, Jesus was the Lamb of God because I look for some other, because he's soft when you approach him,
right?
That sort of thing.
Yeah,
you're pushing it too far.
Right.
I have no idea if Jesus is soft or not.
I don't know. John seemed to love him.
He was nice and comfy.
Yeah.
So there's connections that can be drawn between the language and the thing itself, but we got to make sure we're drawing the right connection.
Yeah, you look for the main one, the main connection.
So you kind of came up with a metaphor,
yeah,
of sorts to help us understand this a little bit. It was
actually
a tadpole.
I'm going to give credit to where credit is due. This
Okay.
actually goes back to the professor that I spoke of.
Yeah.
He's now with the Lord. Tom Frisney, who taught us this, and I was impacted by this. But he talked about how we are like tadpoles in a little pond, swimming around, and we live in our little world, the tadpole world, the pond world, and we have other tadpoles or there's fish in our world. Mm-hmm. There's bubbles in our world. Mm-hmm. There's these plants that grow from the bottom of the pond in our world, and some of our friends believe that this is all the world that there is. There is no other. Others, there's this other group that believes there's another world up there beyond that surface up there. And these other ones, they kind of bicker back and forth with each other. The ones that don't believe, they make fun of those who believe that there's another world, and the ones that believe there's another world, they just keep their faith. But then one day you suddenly start experiencing a change, and you become a frog. And suddenly you hop outside that world, and you discover that we were right. There is another world. And you start seeing things that you've never seen before. Like you might see a flower, or you might see an eagle flying in the blue sky, or a butterfly. And you think, what is this? You've never seen anything like it. And then something really strange comes along. You see the space shuttle being carried back to the Earth, with like piggyback. Now, just imagine you're thinking to yourself, how can I explain this if I go back into the pond and want to explain this to my friends? How would I explain this? And then you think, aha, I remember. I could explain this as what happens when a baby frog sits on the back of its mother frog and goes about in the pond. And so he goes back in there and uses figurative language to explain to them things that they cannot see. I think there's a lot of that going on in the book of Revelation.
You're using language of things that we have experienced to try to explain something that none of us have experienced yet,
right?
Except for the person who is receiving the revelation.
And the one who's in the book of Revelation, the one who's doing this is actually Jesus. He's the one giving John this symbolic way of understanding what's going on in that invisible dimension, the spirit dimension.
You're bringing this up as one reason to use figurative language is that you are describing things that are happening in a whole nother world, a whole nother dimension, where we can't possibly understand it.
It's not the only way that's used.
So you're using language that we are familiar with to describe things that we can't understand currently. And that's not new to me. I remember hearing that in school, and stuff like that. The most important thing is what the author intended.
Right. That's the key.
Right. So how do we do that?
And that is what the whole field of, I'm going to use another big word.
Yeah.
I keep telling people we're not going to use it, and then we do it. It's because these theologians, they think they have to use these big words. But hermeneutics is the study of how to interpret ancient literature. And it could be any literature, but in our case, it would be the study of the scriptures. And so we need to approach this with some good principles and ask ourselves, first of all, look at the grammar of the text itself. What's it saying? Look at how that language has been used elsewhere. If it's a figurative expression, it's very possible that it was used elsewhere. As a matter of fact, the word Babylon used to describe Rome did occur. The Jews started using it after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It started to become common among the Jews to use the word Babylon because they couldn't speak out directly against Rome. That was rather dangerous. And so it became a symbol. And it's a symbol deeply rooted in their history because they had a really bad experience with the literal Babylon of the Old Testament. And so we need to try and look at all the principles that would help you to understand what the author originally meant. Looking at what he was trying to say in the larger context, like the whole book of Revelation. What's the point? That's why we started out talking about the main point of the book, because that helps us to understand individual parts. So a lot goes into trying to figure out what the author intended. It's not just a matter of saying, for example, that just seems too strange. I think I'm going to take it figuratively.
Right.
There's more to it than that.
Right.
I think there's a good example of this, something I read recently in our Bible study is talking about, was we just busted into the New Testament, right? And so what's been on the forefront of my mind is like, well, I understand the things that Jesus has been saying now that I've gone through the whole Old Testament chronologically. And I've been reading a lot of what Jesus said, and I'm confused. Because, like, he's been referencing Isaiah a lot, and Luke especially, because he's writing to Theophilus or something. Luke is trying to explain the things that Jesus said to some other person, right? To help him better understand. And so a lot of times Luke has been saying, and so Jesus fulfilled the prophecy that was said by Isaiah about him living in Nazareth. And you go back there and you fold back to Isaiah and it's like a whole nother complex thing. And I was like, I did not read that way the first time. And I'm like, whoa.
Yeah. So when you read Isaiah originally, before you had got to the New Testament, you remember reading that verse, and you're like, I did not think that that's what that was talking about.
Right.
That's really interesting.
So I can totally agree with you. Like, you got to look at, even though there's two references, you got to look at who the author, Isaiah, what did he mean by it first? And then Luke, what does he mean by it? Because there's kind of two, not different applications, but it feels that way almost.
It should be expected because think about it. We are at least 2,000 years distant from that time, and more for the Old Testament. We are how many miles away distance-wise geographically? And the geography has even changed over those years. Linguistically, we're different. Culturally, we're different. So there's all this distance that we have from it. So it's logical that things would seem weird to us. It's just like if you go to another country that you've never been to, you're going to see weird things, that you don't understand. If you are a missionary, you know what I'm talking about. If you've done it, or somebody who's lived, worked in another culture, or your job sent you there, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's like, why are these people doing this?
So there are dangers to kind of bring us back to the figurative language conversation. There are dangers when we take something that was intended to be figurative and we make it literal. You have a kind of a funny example.
Yeah,
right?
we had an experience that I think illustrates what happens when you take something that was intended to be figurative and take it to be literal. When we first went to Costa Rica, our daughter was maybe 1.5 years old, and we went to a restaurant. And remember, at this point we spoke no Spanish, basically, we ordered something. As we were waiting, my daughter Adina, is her name, was really fidgety and her fidgetiness was throwing food off onto the floor. For any of you who have a 1-year-old, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so when the waitress got there, I can't remember if she spoke English because I don't think I spoke enough. Maybe I did speak more Spanish than I thought. Maybe it was later on in the year. Because I told her she has ants in her pants. And it was just a casual comment. She has ants in her pants. And her response was precious. I mean, she was like, shocked. What? What can I do? How can I help? So basically, there are two main errors. Literalism, which that would be a case of literal taking something literally that was intended to be taken figuratively. And the other is spiritualism, where it was intended to be taken literally, and we spiritualize it. Those are the two things we need to watch out for. And so the danger signs, let's say.
So literalism could kind of be like people who think every passage in the Bible, they'll say everything needs to be taken literally. Yeah. Which sounds good on the surface.
Yeah, it sounds
really like I'm committed to the truth. Everything I'm going to take literally. But you pointed out, they don't even do that. Most people who say that don't actually do that. They have understanding that language works figuratively sometimes, and there's things they interpret figuratively.
Yeah, I've heard one person put it that they said that I take the Bible always literally unless I'm absolutely forced to take it figuratively. I don't think it's a good approach. I think it's the better question. There's no inherent superiority in automatically taking it literally. What is important is like I said, to understand what the author intended. That's the real key,
Right.
to try to figure out what he was trying to do here.
But to give some grace towards people who have this perspective, I do think maybe that person you were talking to, I don't know, but people who I know who have talked this way, I know that one of the reason they're so adamant about that and have such a desire to stick to it this way is because they have seen, once you kind of open that door to this verse doesn't literally mean what you think it means, they worry that it's like a slippery slope thing that opens you up to being able to excuse anything in the Bible that you don't like as not referencing a real reality. It's just a literal reality. But that's where we go back to your original point. Just because something is figurative or not literal
Doesn't make it less real.
doesn't make it less real or less important.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. But the biggest example in the scripture, or the most clear example in the scripture of somebody actually doing this, is Nicodemus. When Jesus talks about being born again, and he says, how can somebody, when they're old, be born again? How can they go back to their mother's womb and be born again? And he's just a good example, because one of the issues with the Pharisees in Jesus' day was that they did take the Bible too literally. They didn't look, and Paul described it as the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. They didn't look at the principle in the code, the legal code. They took everything literally.
And so this is where it is important, though, to continue to go back to what you were saying about there's slippery slopes either way. The way you avoid it is that you make every effort to figure out what was the author intending with those passages.
Yeah.
So
the better way is to find out how people were using those expressions in their time, in their historical context. Find out how these expressions were used in the Old Testament. And look up how they were used in the literature of the time. Those are some ways that you can try to figure out, what that language, because if it's a figurative expression, it has to have some kind of literary, historical connection elsewhere, I would think.
Like a lot of the prophets will use the great and terrible day of the Lord, or phrases like in that day. That's interesting.
Very interesting. So these are the dangers of taking something spiritual, making it literal. The other alternative is also
not good.
Not good. That's taking things that are clearly literal, or maybe not clearly, but intended to be literal, and making them spiritual. So.
Yeah, I think one of the most important examples of this is the language of the new earth, and that we have both in the Old Testament and in the book of Revelation, and in Peter's epistles. Talks about a new earth, and people try to make that spiritual. It's talking about heaven. It's talking about, it's just another description of this heavenly place that Christians are all going to live at the end of time. And there's nothing in the scriptures that would lead one to believe that. The whole Old Testament was very earthly focused in terms of when it talked about the land. And by the way, in the Hebrew, it's the same word. Earth and land are the same thing. And so it was very earthly expectations, and there's no reason to believe that suddenly changed when you got to the New Testament. That all of a sudden this language usage is different. I think we're talking about a literal new earth.
Why do you think that?
Because I just told you. Old Testament usage. Old Testament usage. That's how it was used. That's what.
Because I've
that's what
seen
the word
that
always
phrase
meant.
all over the Old Testament so far, especially by all the prophets.
Well, it goes all the way back to the original promise of the land to Abraham. That's where the promise starts. Remembering that the word land and earth is the same word. Although when we get to Romans, in Romans chapter 4, verse 8, I think it is, Paul talks about that promise given to Abraham, and he says, To Abraham was promised the world. He uses a different word. He expands it and he uses the word cosmos, which usually means the created world, the physical created world. The whole world, we are going to inherit the whole world, he says. When I was in college, in Bible college, a few years ago, I remember the professor, and I won't say his name because don't want to. I don't disparage this professor, but I remember thinking when I heard it, it didn't sound right. When Jesus introduced himself in the synagogue when he started his ministry, he read from the book of Isaiah, and he read this passage that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. And I was told, and by this professor, our whole class was, that this was meant to be spiritual. And this is talking about spiritual realities, not actual physical sickness and blindness and poverty. And I'm thinking to myself, even back then, I knew, but Jesus went around healing the blind and the sick.
Yeah.
And it just didn't seem right. And I think that's a case of spiritualization. And we for some reason, the evangelical church, a sector of it, has gotten into that where everything is spiritual.
Yeah.
We have no sense of how the gospel affects social issues as well, just issues of justice, issues of poverty, things like that. Which is one of the complaints against us, by the way, that we often hear.
And that's a whole nother.
That's a whole nother bucket,
whole nother podcast episode we could get into, which we'll just leave that as a teaser. We'll talk a little bit more about. I think the Book of Revelation in particular. This is going to be This has been one of my convictions, because we don't study it, and I don't think we study it rightly, because we have weird interpretations of what it means, is what gives us permission sometimes to ignore the earth.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And to think God doesn't care about any of this anyways. He's just gonna burn it up and throw it in the trash can, and we're all gonna go be angels on a cloud,
float around on clouds.
So why does it
playing
matter?
Our harps?
Yeah.
So why does it matter what happens to these people? And I think learning how to look at the text and understand what the author was intending in this text is going to be one of the ways forward to help us maybe not make some of those same mistakes. Yeah. So that's kind of what it ultimately all comes down to every single time. And I think I've mentioned it like 6 times because it just keeps coming up. Language can be used in a lot of different ways. We can use one word to represent something else. We can use a word that we're used to represent something that's brand new that we've never had any experience with. We can use a word that a lot of us have heard in one particular context to refer to a context that we have never seen, maybe some kind of spiritual context in some form or another. And sometimes we can use words that we are used to talk about other things that we can't actually see, like Babylon and Rome and various different things like that. There's all different kinds of ways we can use language. And the point being, the way we're going to get to meaning of those words, the way we're going to figure out what those words mean, is we got to figure out who was writing them down and what did they mean when they wrote them down.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us can use the same word to mean a lot of different things, but usually when you're saying one word, when you were writing it in a particular way, there's something particular that you mean by it. So that's going to be the lens we're using to look at a lot of this. We're looking at John. We're looking at what he meant in his context with the history and background that he has to understand what these words can mean and then be able to take that meaning and apply it into our world. After that, you got a closing for us this week, Zach?
Through the tribulation, Jesus is there.
Hey everybody, thanks for checking out this podcast episode. If you want to help us produce it and the other podcasts like it that we do at Wayfarers, I'd encourage you to visit us at wayfarerscc.com/give. I also want to give a shout out to Mid-South Christian College. Myself and our podcasting professor, Greg Waddell, are professors at the school, and if you want to learn more about the Bible, prepare yourself for ministry, Mid-South is one of the best places to do it. Check it out at midsouthchristian.edu. Thanks.